So this little baby in this picture is saying, "Goo goo gaga, why are there so many words on this slide?" as their first words, because this slide is ridiculously word heavy, and I apologize for that. But it's because I want to just review really few quick terms about kinship before we jump into the main lecture. So first of all, when I say kinship, I'm using that more or less interchangeable with the word family, especially if we consider families to include extended families and even sort of extended families like clans and lineages and things of this nature. So there are different, of course, types of that. I mentioned here, there's extended versus nuclear families, and as your book points out, nuclear families, although they seem, I think, very, very, very normal for folks that live in the United States, there's definitely many societies and even many subcultures within the US where it is much more common to think of things in terms of the extended family and for the extended family to live together. And certainly historically in human society, it was extremely, extremely common and has been extremely common across cultures to think of things in terms of extended families rather than simply a nuclear family of the parents and children. So for example, I also teach an Alaska Native Cultures class, and most of the Alaska Native cultures that we're speaking of, such as the Gwich'in, such as Unangash and Sugpiaq people, such as Dena'ina people, many of these groups had really extended family sort of living patterns where families all sort of lived in one home or close to each other, very close to each other. Nuclear families living sometimes close to family and sometimes very far from other family members is very, very common in the United States and in industrialized Europe, among other places. And it's become more and more common in the world, and you might ask yourself, why is that the case? And as you think about it, I think part of what you'll probably realize is that economics has a lot to do with it, in the sense that even in the United States, things were much more extended family based up through the early 1800s. But with the Industrial Revolution and the moves to cities, it became much more common for people to have highly specialized jobs where you might need to move cities to find a job in your specialty. So, for example, I'm an anthropology professor, and to find jobs in my field involved me moving to Denton, Texas at one point, and now has involved me moving to Soldotna, Alaska. If you're an auditory therapist, a speech pathologist, something in this nature, there may very well not be a position within, let's say, Ninilchik, if you live in Ninilchik and you move to Anchorage instead, or maybe you move down to the lower 48. So we kind of get a sense then of the fact that when people economically specialize, it often requires them to move away from their family. The other thing about it is that the U.S., and I want to hesitate here because the U.S. is very culturally diverse, and so anytime I say the U.S., that's a bit of a kind of artificial generalization. But I guess I'll say for a lot of folks in the U.S., individualism is a ideal that we stress very heavily. We stress it in terms of how we talk to children, how we train children, how we raise children, also how we talk to ourselves, right? Our emphasis on things like self-care, loving yourself, accepting yourself, you do you, fly your freak flag, all the different ways we kind of talk to each other about emotional health tend to emphasize the individual pretty strongly, as do the ways we raise children. We tend to emphasize a lot children kind of gaining independence as they go along. Your book calls that independence training. And so with a pretty independence and individualistic focus within U.S. culture, it's not surprising that the nuclear family kind of becomes the dominant family structure, since that's sort of the most down to the level of the individual, right? It's the individual with the person that they, of their own volition, for their own desires, choose to marry, and then the children that they have. So that's extended versus nuclear family, as well as the bigger term of kinship. But again, if I use kinship throughout this lecture, think of it as pretty much interchangeable with family. There's a few different kinds of kinship. Affinal kinship means related by marriage, so your in-laws and so forth, if you have in-laws. Consanguineal kinship would be those to whom somebody is related by, quote, blood, as we call it, although that's not really biologically accurate, it's DNA, aka those to whom you're related by descent. There's also, across cultures, so there's definitely both of these types of relationships in all sorts of cultures. And your book talks about families of orientation and families of procreation as one way of explaining that. There's also what we would call fictive kinship. So fictive kinship, I don't love the term because fictive makes it sound like it's not real, and that's not really what we mean. But what we mean is, in many societies, I would say in most societies, we have ways of people being related to each other where they're not married, they're not related through law, quote unquote, they're also not related through by descent, they're also not related to by adoption, like legal adoption, which we would really kind of put under consanguineal kinship probably, but instead they're related in other kinds of ways. So, for example, when I go to the Navajo reservation to do field work or talk to friends there, I am the son of a man who lives in Loop, Arizona, and his wife. He is Navajo, she is Filipino, I am Euro-American, I'm Caucasian, and I did not grow up on the Navajo reservation, and as you might guess, I am not their literal child in either a biological or legal sense of the word. Instead, it's a relationship of adoption. In fact, on the Navajo reservation generally, it's very common for people to use these kinds of kinship terms, brother, older brother, younger brother, to kind of describe close emotional relationships, as indeed it is in our in broader American society. It's pretty common for people to call each other brother or sister or uncle or auntie based on these sort of friendship relationships. The reading that you did from Malaysia, the Karsten reading, The Substance of Kinship, I thought that was a really cool, interesting example. This idea that sort of families, that people that eat together become family. And so a brother and a sister are very much like each other until they leave, until they no longer live with each other. And then since they're eating different pots of food, so to speak, living in different houses, eating different food, they become less and less related. Whereas somebody can be a stranger, let's say an anthropologist like Karsten, and eat for a long time with a group of people, live in their home, and you sort of become related to them by virtue of the fact that you've eaten a lot with them. It's sort of thought of as like a substance that's shared through food. That is fascinating. And part of what this says for me when we think about the bigger questions of anthropology, like human nature, is that humans gonna family, right? We want to have some kind of connectedness with people, and we want to feel like there's relationships there. And even more so, not just relationships, but I think relationships where you can depend on them for certain types of obligations and depend on them, that they're going to have your back, that they're going to provide, that they're going to be with you, that they're going to help you, that they're going to mentor you. It's similar, for example, in South London, you have a lot of folks that refer to each other as cousins, but you'll have like lower income neighborhoods where you have like an Irish person, a person of from Indian, or at least Indian descent rather recently, and people from other parts of sort of South Asia, so people from multiple different countries and perhaps even different continents who use the term cousin to refer to each other. And it's not meant to be literal, although in a sense it is, since this is supposed to be people that you can depend on, rely on, they have your back. So these are different forms of family. Now, that kind of lays it out pretty simple, the whole by blood, by law, or fictive kinship, although sometimes it gets a little more complicated even in those seemingly straightforward categories. So for example, let's take the Kulina, which are a small indigenous group located in Brazil, who have been researched, among others, by my mentor, my anthropology colleague, Don Pollock, out of University of Buffalo. And as he points out, somewhat humorously, but also somewhat interestingly, for Kulina people, there is a kind of classic insult where one man insults another by saying, when she was pregnant with her kid, this is what one man would be saying, when your wife was pregnant with that kid, I slept with her more than you did. So he would be saying that to the husband. So what's going on there is within Kulina society, it's thought that males contribute to the physical building of the child within the womb through contributions of sperm or semen. So it's not like the way we think about this within Western science, where sort of the actual physical contribution of the male, although it's very genetically important, the actual physical contribution is extremely small. By contrast, in Kulina society, every time a man and a woman have sex, if she's pregnant, the man is sort of contributing to the building up of the baby. So what this can lead to is if the woman has had an affair on her husband, I never know what to call him, a man in a illicit sexual relationship. Would he be the mister as opposed to the mistress? I have no idea. Anyways, the man who is having the affair with the woman will insult the properly married husband by basically implying that he contributed more of the material to the child than the husband. And, it is kind of a burn, but it's also kind of a serious burn. He can contest paternity on those grounds and say, well, it's really my kid. So kinship gets complicated.